for another episode of Jazz's Daily Brunch. Thanks for being here.
Restart now. Restart.
Good morning or good late morning. Michael Fagan here from Jazziz. Bring you another episode of Jazz's Daily Brunch. This morning, I have with me jazz legend Bob James. Morning, Bob.
I'm very, very, very happy to be seeing you. What are you serving me for brunch?
I actually do a light brunch, just a cup of coffee.
Well, I already have my espresso here. So.
Cheers.
Cheers.
And for those of you who know Bob James, you know what a legend he is, and we're going to get into that. He is, one of the most influential artists when it comes to contemporary jazz. For me, it all started with an album that was my first Bob James album called Touchdown. And I think for a lot of people, especially that are my age, they bought Touchdown in the store. It had this beautiful football on the cover. And of course, the popular track on there was from the hit TV series, Taxi. Bob, to get into this, that was a seminal moment in your career. Can you tell us how that all happened?
Like so many things, when I think back on it, and boy, oh boy, these days I have a lot of opportunities to think back. It's mostly about memories and mostly about nostalgia. And when I am still able to talk to people by this online method, I've been hearing so many different things from people around the world, and it reminds me of what the incredible thing with recorded music and how it goes all over the world to places that you could never anticipate. At the time of that recording, I was immersed in the New York City scene. I had finally found a niche at this record company, CTI, a few years before that, where I did all kinds of arrangements. And yet I was kind of yearning to break free from it and go out on my own. And a very wonderful jazz producer named Bruce Lundvall set me up over at Columbia Records to produce my own music there and actually start my own label at almost the same time you started your label, as a matter of fact. So we have a very kind of similar history that went on during that time. And I definitely still remember my lack of understanding about why some things became popular and some things didn't, and what you had to do with your music in order to make it be memorable. And I never liked any of the theories that people had about it, because I always feel like that the public is smarter than theories are, that they'll realize it when you're copying somebody else and when you're not being honest, when you're not being yourself. So that album, yes, it was a chance for me to put the music from the TV series that I was working on at that time, a sitcom called Taxi, that I knew was going on national television, but you never know when the show is going to be successful or not. Some of those shows run for 1 year and then they're off. But I got very lucky because I was asked to do that music for a series that became super popular and ended up in syndication all over the world. And my little theme, Angela, rode that train. I was able to go on board and have my music heard a million times more than it would have been heard otherwise. So I'm
Wow.
still grateful to this very day about that. But it was kind of a fluke. I wasn't doing TV music at that time. There was one of the producers of that series had my previous album, well, 2 albums before that, Bob James 4, which I had done for CTI Records, and he had it in his collection, and he liked the mood of it, and they were trying to figure out what kind of mood to do on the TV show. So he was playing that music behind some of the rough footage that they were working on, and they decided, well, why don't you call the guy who made that music and ask him if he'll contribute something new. And that's what happened. So the original request was just to create some new music similar to what I did on BJ4. And one
Bob,
of the pieces. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Can you, for listeners who may, and people are viewing this today who may not have heard that song, I can't imagine how, it was everywhere. Can you play a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
Wow, thanks, Bob. Yeah, that was it for me. In fact, for me, I'd never heard music like that before that album, and you brought up a couple things that I'd like to touch on. One is Bruce Lundvall. Bruce has been so, pervasive in people and companies that he's helped get into the jazz world. I am one of them too. I remember talking to Bruce when I started Jazziz magazine in a 1-bedroom apartment. I was calling him from my kitchen, and that phone on the wall, I remember it vividly like it was yesterday. And the phone rang, picked it up, and it's Bruce Lundvall. And he said he got my name from someone and my number. He had no idea he was calling, and I was answering in my kitchen. He thought he was calling some office. And he told me how at the time he was at Electra Musician, which was a cool jazz imprint at Warner back then.
Didn't he kind of start that? Wasn't that his little?
Yes, Electra Musician was his.
Yeah.
And I loved Electra Musician, and I Lee Ritenour and other great artists were on that label. And he told me how he's going to be leaving Electra, kind of confidentially, and basically rejuvenating the Blue Note brand. And I said, wow, that's, label started in 1939. That sounds great. And he says, and I'd like, you to be part of that and help with your magazine. And I said, count me in. Bruce Lundvall became my first advertiser from the record labels, and was supportive, all the way through. My favorite thing about Bruce, in addition to the friendship we forged over the years, is that he was always there to support me in any way. And then one day I had the chance to, I guess in some way, pay him back, although I don't take responsibility for what ultimately happened. And that was, I got a demo tape from a colleague of mine. It was a CD, actually. It was a demo CD. And I took it gracefully and stuck it in my car. And then a couple of months later, I wanted to listen to something in my car while I was heading home, driving home. And I put it in and I said, wow, what the heck is this? And I looked at it and I said, oh, this is Elaine, my colleague's niece. And so I called Elaine the next day and I said, Elaine, I finally listened to your niece's CD, the demo CD. And I think she's one of the most amazing singers I've ever heard. She said, you really think so? Well, you signed her to your label. That was at a time where we had IE Music and Verve, but we had just sold it. Universal acquired Polygram. We got out and I said, I don't have a label anymore, but I want you to call my friend Bruce Lundvall. He'll know exactly what to do. Because as you know, Bruce always knew what to do. And that young singer was Norah Jones.
I knew that's who you were going to say too.
Yeah.
That's completely
and
awesome.
It was like, there's the ultimate payback. Again, I don't claim any responsibility for success or connecting the dots. I was just glad to be in some very small part of that. And it was for Bruce because I just love Bruce so much.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic. And of course, we both know that the great story about what happened after that. And Bruce was very much similar um, person for me, in addition to him being the primary reason why I got signed to Columbia and left CTI Records. Uh, uh, he also masterminded the project that turned out to become my first Grammy Award, because at that time there was a great guitarist who was signed to his Blue Note label, Earl Klugh.
Earl, sure.
And he started trying to figure out a way that could get the two of us together to collaborate. And as you know, sometimes when the artists have exclusive deals with different labels, it can become very complicated legally, contractually, whatever. But Bruce was able to work it out. And he didn't produce the one-on-one record that I did with Earl Klugh, but he was the mastermind behind it, and the one that made it go smoothly, and the one, I think, probably the person that had the idea of us collaborating. I had only known Earl very mostly by his reputation at that time. And then now that I'm thinking back on it, the chronology, I'm not sure whether my Touchdown record came first or the one-on-one record. They all almost at the same time.
Yeah, if I remember, they were less than 2 years apart.
Right, because Earl played on Touchdown also. He was featured on it, and maybe the Touchdown record was the one that inspired the one-on.
Yeah,
that
I think
kind of makes sense.
If I remember, because I remember as a fan and a consumer, I bought Touchdown first and then one-on-one.
Yeah, I think that's probably the order in which it happened.
And you know, the interesting thing about one-on-one and a lot of your early releases on Tappan Zee Columbia, your label through Columbia, which had nothing to do with the music, and that was the incredible photography and packaging of those albums. How did that come about? Because you know, whether it was Touchdown or Lucky 7 or even other artists on your label like Mark Colby with that gigantic screw on the cover, these were just phenomenal. In fact, it was an inspiration for me being in the media business. The kind of the imaging and positioning and presentation was so superlative. What was that all about?
Well, I completely agree with you, and we both know how much the business has changed, and having that kind of artistic approach to music has become a totally different kind of a challenge now. But I credit, for the most part, the genius, marketing, and artistic spirit of Creed Taylor for that, because one of the main things that he was talking about all the time during the years that I was working with him was packaging. And he wanted his records to look different from the other records in the record store, and he wanted them to stand out. And he worked with several different artistic directors, but he also loved fine art photography. And I remember Pete Turner, the fine art photographer, was one of the people that Creed loved a lot, and Pete Turner's work ended up on a lot of CTI covers. But they were very simple. They looked good because he always used high gloss lamination so that the records didn't look like the cheap, dull cardboard. They were shiny, and you could feel like you really liked picking them up in the record store. And they were big enough because they were 12 inches.
Yeah, 12-inch squares. They were this big.
Yeah, it was like a little piece of art in the record store. And if you were lucky enough that your covers looked artistic, the record store owner might stick them out there in the open the more, and you just get that much more exposure. So that was, by the time I left CTI, that was a little bit part of my identity, because I'd made 4 solo records for them, all of which had that kind of high gloss lamination and double fold.
Yeah,
for the consumer, it wasn't just a slip sleeve. It was a double fold where you open it up, and there was all kinds of liner note information on the inside, and photography and so forth. So I carried that tradition with me over to Columbia when I was producing records there and for my own label. But I had to call upon my friendship with Bruce to whatever degree that he could be influential, because a lot of these things end up in the finance department and the people who are concerned about budgets. And they're saying, well, why do you need that double fold? It costs twice as much to manufacture. You don't need this high gloss lamination. Why don't we just keep it simple? And I fought as hard as I could. I learned that I didn't love that part of the business world very much, and eventually got out of it, actually. But I could see the power of it, and I miss it now. I know lots of us who were big fans of the vinyl LP era miss it a lot. And isn't it amazing that it had a resurgence? Now people are buying vinyl. I still have to carry big boxes with me out on the road, and I'm still signing LPs at my live concerts because there's still an audience for it.
Yeah. Well, we all miss vinyl, and I do. There's an audience out there that loves. We lost something when we moved to 5-inch CDs and 5-inch packaging.
Yeah,
and the covers that you had on your vinyl albums shrunk down when we went to CDs, even when they were all reissued. It just didn't feel the same, pun intended.
Right. It certainly didn't. And now we don't even have that, because the CD market is not what it was, and people stream. So we have to become more cognizant of how people are experiencing our music, and the packaging sometimes has to have some kind of aspect that looks good on the thumbnail, so people are only going to be seeing it less than 1 inch big.
Yeah, it's
could have some kind of artistic thing. My latest album, Espresso, I have that big espresso cup, and even if it's a teeny little thumbnail, hopefully there's some kind of a visual reference.
So let me back up even a little bit more, because CTI was so influential, not only to you, but to a whole jazz scene that Creed was doing back then. And you worked with and sort of nurtured a lot of artists on CTI that became big stars in the jazz world.
Very, very lucky time for me. That's the thing I probably remember the most about it, because I love the theater, and my best friend is a director in the theater, and I spent a lot of time getting to know the way the actors function, especially in a repertory group where all the actors come together. And in one show you're the leader, in another show you're just a supporting actor. And I felt like during that time, especially during those CTI years, we had a repertory group, and we were all supportive of each other. One day there might be Hubert Law's album, and I'm just called on to just play the piano. But on the next session, it might be my record, and I could have Hubert come in and be a sideman on my project. And there was a lot of back and forth, and all of these artists, so many of them that I got to know and work with because of the way the CTI label operated. He had the small network of people that he used over and over and over again, and Ron Carter and Billy Cobham at that time, so many people. Grover Washington.
I was just going to say Grover.
Yeah, he exploded in a way that's the way the music business works. Sometimes things just jump out, and you can't avoid the uniqueness of the sound of the artist and everything else. And definitely I was lucky to be asked to be the arranger on Grover's early recordings there. And they helped establish my reputation in New York as an arranger, and they helped me form my own style as an artist. They were great years.
Yeah, Grover was such a wonderful man too. I'm sure you had great time spending with him making those records, because he was such a gentleman.
Definitely. Yeah.
You know, the one Grover story that I have is that when I had my little boutique label in the Verve Group with Lee and Mark, Lee Ritenour and Mark Wexler, we met with Grover, and he actually agreed to be signed to IE Music. And we were very excited because Grover was such an international star. And we get a call from Grover one day, at the time before he agreed to come to IE Music, he was still on Columbia. And he called us up. He goes, guys, I don't even know how to say this. He said, but Sony came back to me and they're offering me 6 records firm. Now, Bob knows what that means. For those who don't know the vernacular in the music business, it means that they're willing to pay him for the next 6 records whenever he records them and releases them. It's a really good business deal. And
if you happen to know of any label out there that would give me that offer now, please give me their phone number.
Yes, and you can email me, and I will connect you with Bob. Anyone who's interested in the 6 records firm. So what we did is I said, Grover, this is such an unbelievable deal. You got to do it. I mean, I'd love to have you on the label. You got to do what's good for you. And he did. And then sadly, I think before he released his first album of the 6, he passed.
Yeah. You probably wouldn't know my story related to that exact period of time. But I'll try to make this short. But my story related.
Make it long.
Related to Grover was I was in my car. I was living in Westchester County at that time, outside of New York City, and I was driving into Manhattan, listening to CD 101.9, the jazz station at that time, with Pat Prescott was the DJ at that time, and she was interviewing Grover on the air because Grover was in town in New York to perform somewhere. And they were talking about Mr. Magic, which was Grover's big record from the album called Mr. Magic, which I had arranged the music for. And Grover was talking about the process of making that record. And he was mentioning all these different names, Ralph McDonald, and he mentioned a few names that turned out not really to be right. His memory was a little foggy. But I kept waiting for my name to get mentioned, and it didn't happen. And Grover and Pat are talking about it. But in my mind, I knew that I had chosen that song out of Ralph McDonald's repertoire of this publishing company that he worked with. Mm-hmm. And I chose the song at that time primarily because I thought the title was great for Grover, Mr. Magic, great title. So I prepared the arrangement of that song 2 weeks before we went into the studio. But in Grover's description of it at that time to Pat Prescott, he described it as being just improvised, and that he and Ralph McDonald kind of put it together in the studio with no arrangement. So I'm getting frustrated. Now at this point, I'm driving my car. I'm almost driving off the road. So they got this wrong. And I've been written out of history on the CD 101.9. So when I got to a place where I could make a phone call, I finally called Pat Prescott. And by that time, Grover had left the studio. And I said, Pat, I got removed from this record. It was kind of a big deal for me at that time. And Pat says, "Oh, I understand your frustration, Bob, but you've got your side of the story, and Grover's got his side. Why don't I get both of you in the studio at the same time, and I'll interview you both?" And I said, "Well, hey, okay, I welcome the opportunity." And as it turned out, several weeks later, they arranged an interview for both Grover and me, and they had brought a little keyboard into the radio station. Grover brought his tenor into the studio, and Pat interviewed us both about Mr. Magic. And Grover was, as you remember him, total gentleman, totally acknowledged that his memory was a little distant. And as we often do when we're doing interviews, we don't remember every detail. But he definitely, by that time, remembered that I had written that arrangement for him. And we had a wonderful little interview during which we played a live duet version, me and him, of Mr. Magic on the air in New York. And the crazy irony of it was the next day that he passed.
Wow.
He was supposed to be playing a concert at Madison Square Garden, and as I recall.
Mm.
But it was so poignant for me because whatever baggage or whatever negative feelings that I might have been carrying as a result of listening to that previous interview, we bonded, we were friends, and that's the wonderful, very, very positive memory that I have of Grover.
Wow. Well, at a slightly more happier note, I have a story about you in the car listening to the radio. I don't know if you remember this, Bob, but one night we went out to dinner. Actually, I'm gonna bring my son Jeffrey in here. You came to my hotel, the Michelangelo. It's on 51st and 7th in New York, and I made Jeffrey practice. I showed him pictures of you. He was only, I want to say, 3 years old at the time.
It's coming back to me. I'm remembering you're describing it.
And I said, when this man walks in the front door, I want you to run up to him. This was in the front door lobby. It was snowing outside. And I want you to say, "Hi, Bob James." So you walked in, you're kind of brushing yourself off. It's frigid cold outside. You have your long coat on. And this little rugrat runs up to you and says, "Hi, Bob James." And you just kind of freaked. You were like, "What's this all about?"
Get out of here, you Bob.
But what happened that night was also very magical as far as radio. And that is, we went out to dinner, Judy and you and me and actually my ex-wife, Lori. And we had a great dinner. It was some great Italian restaurant on Central Park South. And afterwards, you drove in from Westchester, and then you decided you're going to drive us back to the hotel. I get in the car with you. We turn on the radio, and Angela, the theme song from Taxi, is playing. And I'm thinking, man, you called up the radio station and set this whole thing up. There is no way. And then after a while, you convinced me that no, they're just playing it. And of course, it was such a popular composition that they played it a lot. But then we started talking about that song and wonderful people on that album. And we started talking about Eric Gale. And I remember you getting very sentimental, saying, "Gosh," and Judy too. She was like, he was so wonderful.
Still do get so sentimental about that.
Yeah.
Eric was kind of loner socially, or lived in a very different world. So I didn't ever have the opportunity to get to know him away from the studio or away from performing the way I wish that I could have to have gotten more of an insight into him as a person. But the contributions that he's made to my music and to so many other people's music are just limitless and completely unique. It's people like that I realize when I'm listening to them that no matter how much we practice, there's a certain mystery that never will be able to be explained by logic. It could just only be explained by something else.
Right. Something we don't really understand, but we're trying. Yeah. And so that period from CTI to Tappan Zee on Columbia, then you moved to Warner. And I think if I remember, it was Tommy LaPuma that may have helped that transition. How'd that all happen?
He was involved. Mo Austin was really the main mover there, and Lenny Warnaker. All those people were involved. And at that time, I was being managed by Michael Tannen, who was very much my good fortune to have met him sort of through Paul Simon. And I had been asked by the producer, Phil Ramone, to do some work with Paul Simon. And during the course of that, I met Paul Simon's manager, who was Michael Tannen. And Michael became interested in me separately, wanting to represent me as kind of like lawyer manager to help me out. And it was during the time of my transition from CTI to Columbia. And so Michael actually carved out a deal for me at Columbia, and it was very. I had a good weapon, because even though the numbers of my deal seemed really, really, really good to me, but when Michael was talking to the Columbia lawyers, my numbers were so small compared to Paul Simon's numbers that they weren't really concerned about it at all, that they'd give me a nice deal if Michael would cooperate with them to pull it down a little bit for Paul, or however that works out with lawyers.
Mm-hmm.
So he was very involved right from the beginning of when I was at Columbia, but he was also involved when I made the exit, which was tricky and not always completely friendly.
Yeah,
but
it's a divorce in some ways.
Exactly, it was exactly that. And then when the legal people start to get hard nosed about it, they're trying to be as rough as they can. And there was a time when I recall that they didn't even want Michael Tannen to be led in the CBS building.
Wow.
He was kind of like an enemy. But then later I learned that Bruce Lenvall himself had been negotiating his own deal for when he was going to actually leave Columbia also. And lo and behold, who did Bruce call to be his lawyer? He called my friend Michael Tannen, who they had been friends with by that time. And I then really knew that I had a good lawyer representing me in Michael. And it led to some really, really good years at Warner Brothers. And probably the most dramatic good news about that time there at Warner is when I was able to take an idea of forming a group to the bosses at Warner Brothers, and I said that I have this idea for a group called Foreplay, and would they be interested in sponsoring it? And they said yes, and that's how the group Foreplay started.
Wow, and you know, it's funny. You and I met about 30 something years ago, and in fact, if I remember correctly, I think it may have been at a festival on a golf course in Sanibel Island, Florida.
Oh, is that where we met? Yeah,
Yeah,
I remember that.
I think so. And we started talking, and I had just formed a friendship with Lee Ritenour at that time. And I brought up Lee, and Lee had already played on one or two of your records. And you had remarked, you know, he's a really talented guitarist. He's got great ideas. And I was like, yeah, I've always thought that about him too. And of course, back then we knew, there goes my light. Hang on one sec. Jeffrey tells me to keep pushing this thing. We knew him more on the fusion side. You know, he did a lot of fusion records for Columbia Epic, actually, over at the CBS. Mm-hmm. I guess it was called back then. But then you kind of, I mean, Lee was heading in that direction. He did that album with Dave Grusin that was more acoustic. But it clearly came out in some of your projects. And then, of course, in Foreplay, this gentle side of Lee, where there's just this phenomenal playing, this great writing. And tell me about your personal and professional relationship with Lee.
Well, you're right. There's some kind of magic that goes on when you meet somebody and you start playing music with them. In our field, where yes, some of our arrangements have prepared music, but it's the spontaneous, unprepared stuff that usually becomes the most special. And when you start improvising with a new person that you're meeting for the first time, you find out things about them that you would never find out otherwise. And what was happening in this studio in LA, where I had gone out to record music for an album of mine that ended up being called Grand Piano Canyon. Primarily, I went out there for two reasons, because I was doing all of my work in New York, but I really wanted to work with Harvey Mason. And he had made so many records for me, including Mr. Magic, by the way, including so many things that Harvey had played on where we had invited him to come out to New York. But this particular time, it seemed to make more sense to go out to LA because I also wanted to work with Lee Ritenour, and I wanted him to play on one of the tunes on that project because we had started a kind of reciprocal negotiation with each other in which, hey, if I know you want me to play on your album and I want to play on yours, vice versa. Let's keep all of our costs down. And if you play a song for me or write a song for me, I'll write one for you, and we'll go back and forth in that kind of way. And in that sort of bargaining mode, uh, I wanted Lee to play on this record, and he ended up also composing a tune for it called "Just Listen," which is also on that album.
Mm-hmm.
So I had 3 out of 4 other people, but I didn't know the LA scene very well, and didn't know who to get to play bass. So separately, I called Lee and I called Harvey, and I said, who should I get on bass? And Harvey said, well, I think maybe Nathan East would be a good call. Then separately, I called Lee. Lee came up with the same answer. So that was good enough for me that both of them thought Nathan was good. So it was first time working with Nathan East for me. And we ended up in the studio, the 4 of us, doing several days of sessions. And I'm not sure that I was the first person to bring it up. We have various memories of how the conversation started. But I know that I was really curious at that time about the different music that comes out of a group situation from what comes out of the ego of one's individual artist. Because the individual artist, it's their music, and everybody becomes a little bit subservient or cooperative.
Yeah, sort of a supportive role.
That one supportive role and one outside of a vision. But I knew that there were many other groups in our field, Weather Report and Spiral Gyra, and I don't know, so many different groups where the group itself had an identity that the public became aware of that went beyond the individual identities of the members. So we were just talking about it on a break. And I had never been in a group. And I asked the other 3 guys, had they ever had that experience? And I'm pretty sure you'd have to ask them because I don't remember the names of the groups, but I think Lee had been in one, and they all talked about it. But also in my memory, they didn't last. The loyalty or whatever hadn't happened.
That's kind of the history of groups, right? They break up.
They do, sure. And so we talked about what would the odds be that if we formed a group that it would stay together beyond one album, because there also had been this kind of all-star band type of album that would maybe last 1 or 2 albums at the most, but especially when people were already busy and successful on their own. And all 4 of us at that time had pretty strong careers individually going. So we were pessimistic that it would last for a long time, but still we felt magic. We felt I know that there was something going on between the 4 of us where we all shared a lot of the same interests. And so we started it up. And I also remember that the group that we used as a reference was Modern Jazz Quartet. And they definitely had a sound that lasted for many, many, many years through several different bass players and drummers, but the combination of John Lewis and Milt Jackson was the most unique part of their sound and their identity. And frankly, when we talked about it at that time, we thought it was very, very unlikely that we would last long enough and that we'd stay together long enough to have a sound of our own. And now to be able to look back on it 28, 29 years later, however long it's been, is very, gives me warm feeling to know that I'm confident now that we did conquer that. And we did arrive at our own sound. And many people tell us that when they listen to our recordings, they know it's our sound.
Yeah, and so Foreplay, four incredibly talented, successful individual artists, and three of those have maintained throughout almost 30 years. The one sort of musical chairs has been your guitarists, but you seem to have a knack on picking some of the greatest contemporary guitarists ever. It started with Lee, but then when Lee and this happened at a weird time because Lee and I started IE Music, a record label, and he wanted to dedicate time to making the Twisted Joe Beam and other projects, and I almost feel bad and responsible that that's when he left Foreplay because he ran out of time. But you had no problem finding another great guitarist in Larry Carlton.
Yeah, again, looking back on it from a memory standpoint, to have the opportunity to carve out music in combination with three different guitar players who had such completely different styles, and for me to learn how to be supportive. The piano and the guitar in a group like that, we very often operate in the same territory, in this sort of middle ground of the audio, middle ground of the chords, where the support of the music comes in. And you put the wrong pianist with the wrong guitarist, and you get clash. And we voice the chords differently. We have a different idea of what that rhythm is supposed to be, or what the sound is supposed to be. But when you're lucky enough to be with the great players that have the great ear, and they know how to stay out of your way, and you let them know that you know how to stay out of their way, we can carve out music that works.
Yeah, and if I could say the one thing, Bob, that what I noticed about you as a keyboardist and the guitarists, there always was this conversation, you listening to each other and not talking over each other.
That's the most fun.
That was one of the magical sort of aspects of Foreplay.
Yeah, and it has to be in a group situation. It's a give and take. We all know the unbelievably great music that comes from the opposite kind of situation with the almost dictator type leader, and that also can lead to great things. Miles Davis or Charles Mingus. I don't know. I don't know who to think about where you become one of his minions, or his or her minion, depending on what the situation is. But I like to think that the history of the Foreplay group and what made us different was this spirit of four-way democracy that we decided was going to be our goal. And we started out very early on to say there will be no leader, which was very, very challenging. Many business people told me it was going to be impossible, because there has to be a first among equals. There has somebody that has to make the tough decisions. And every time we'd have a tough decision we had to make, we would vote, because we were a democracy. And the vote is 2-2. And now what do you do?
Now what do you do?
So then we just kind of flounder, and but somehow we kept toughing it out, and we found that we got through those tough times. But I think the music has that kind of sound. I think it definitely sometimes has my sound, sometimes has Harvey's sound, sometimes has Nathan's sound, and we have three different guitar sounds that are part of our history.
Yeah.
I got to say again, on behalf of Lee, going way back to the beginning, that Lee established a pretty heavy history right off the bat from our first record, and was probably, I mean, beyond probably, the reason why the Foreplay group has the kind of guitar sound that it has, was because he invented the Foreplay guitar sound. And Ballyrun and the songs on that very first record are probably still our most requested songs, and it's just like a stamp that's part of our identity.
Yeah, my favorite Foreplay albums, the first album, and then your anniversary album, Silver.
Oh, thank you for saying that, because
So
there was a
many,
lot of
so
heart
many
in that
years
album.
later, you think, okay, another Foreplay album. Okay, what are they going to do this time? And it wound up being one of my favorites.
I'm very glad to hear you say that, because it has turned out to be an album that we can celebrate, and to remember Chuck Loeb, who revitalized our group. We had reached the point where, after Larry Carlton decided that he wanted to pursue his solo career also, we were beginning to think that maybe we would never find that new loyal guitarist spirit. But when Chuck joined, it was immediate how much ambition he had, how much enthusiasm, respect did he have for us, but a kind of energy that made the rest of the three of us go to the practice room, because a lot of his charts were hard, they were challenging, and the Silver album in many ways represents a culmination of a lot of that, and very much enthusiasm on Chuck's part to even make that record happen.
And one of the things I noticed about Chuck is that he was clearly the lesser known of the four, the one that was kind of, if you were a contemporary jazz fan, you've heard of Chuck Loeb, but most people didn't hear Chuck Loeb. And I looked at it as like he had something to prove, and he proved it.
Yes, and he knew that we could give him the opportunity to have that happen, to reach a wider audience. And I think that did happen. But still, I'm still amazed at that the history that he created, almost always being the best kept secret in the music business.
Yes.
There was a way that he was always behind the scenes. He was always doing great things, but it never was an artist ego, because he, at least 50% of the time, he was producing for other artists, doing all kinds of other things behind the scenes.
And the other thing, like you, I mean, people, associate Chuck with kind of contemporary and smooth jazz, but that wasn't his roots. He came from very traditional jazz roots.
Yes, and that's why Harvey and I were the main pushers. Not to say that Nathan didn't love him also, but in my memory of when we were trying to figure out who to get next, I believe I was the first one to bring up Chuck, because I'd worked with Chuck more than they had. But what we liked about it is that we always had the feeling that there was straight ahead jazz roots that were at the ground level of Foreplay sound, and that Harvey's and my main loves in the jazz field go way back in jazz history. They weren't just part of a modern smooth jazz world.
Well, a good segue. Your identifying Chuck to be a perfect fit as the third guitar player in Foreplay. You've discovered a lot of talent. In fact, if not discovered, they appeared on your album before they became big. From the early days with some of the great contemporary jazz artists that wound up having solo careers, to even, I think around 2008, Esperanza Spalding was on your record before people really knew who she was.
Well, thank you for saying that. I couldn't take very much credit there. What an amazing artist that she is. Yeah, I guess part of that is when you're busy, when you're doing a lot of things. When I'm involved at that time, much more than now, but then I was very, very busy in the studio a lot and working with different people. In what you're describing, I guess some things stick out more than others. Kirk Whalum comes to my mind as being somebody. With him, my first experience with him was a kind of, if you can't beat him, join him type of thing, because he was opening act at a concert that I was playing in Houston, Texas, and I went out to hear his band. and they were killing it so much they had this audience wiped out before I even got to the stage. And so I thought, well, this is not going to be my night, because I could try to come up with something, but it's not going to be on the level of what Kirk was giving them. So then I got this idea. Hey, why don't I have him join my band?
Yeah.
And then I have the best of both worlds. And I was working on an album project at that time. So I called him immediately and invited him to come out to New York and play on my album 12.
And I think that the kind of track that really showcased was, I think, Ruby, Ruby, Ruby.
Right, which is also Kirk's wife, a song that he wrote for her.
Yeah.
And I got to learn what a great composer he is. And then right after that, we went out on tour together, became good friends, and led a whole bunch of things, including me ending up signing him to my label and producing him. And we're still going strong in that world. So those are the fun stories to be able to look back on it, where you see the talent. You can't promise anything, as you well know, as much as if we're functioning as a label or as producers or advisors, we can say, boy, you are super talented. You're going to have a great future ahead of you, but we can't predict what that's going to be. Too many variables coming in there.
And Kirk, and it was you that introduced me to Kirk. It may have been that same Sanibel show.
Could be. He was probably playing on that show, I would imagine.
And he and I have become lifelong friends, and he's just a one. You know, I always say this about, as far as contemporary saxophonists, you could argue about technique. You know, the people will say who they like best. What I love about Kirk, I don't think anyone has the sound that Kirk has on sax.
I completely agree with you. And he finally brought us back to that era when I grew up, where the actual sound, they were playing the same instruments, but the concept of production of sound changed so much. But my two biggest, I was the biggest fan of Stan Getz and Paul Desmond.
Me too.
And those sounds were so unique at that time, and you didn't hear them that much until I heard Kirk. And suddenly not that Kirk was trying to sound like Getz or anything like that. He had his own voice, but it had this warmth and a kind of thickness and ability to go straight to your heart.
Yeah. Kirk's great. So, with Kirk and your career and solo and foreplay, they've said, and the they people, that you are the godfather, the progenitor of smooth jazz. How does that sit with you?
Fine. Hey, I like smooth. I like rough.
Yeah.
I like them both. And if the criticism is that we get too smooth, okay. Criticism is inevitable, and our job is to make music and hope that some people like it. Not all people are going to like it, and the phenomenon of what happened with smooth jazz is debatable because of the function of it a lot. There was a time in which jazz became a buzzword for comfort or for background, and when the term started to get used, smooth jazz, it wasn't musicians that were making that, putting those two things together.
Mm-hmm.
It was a business thing. It was advertisers. It was marketing. And so what happened, and I know it happened with me, in that format, the only music of mine that got played in that format was the smoothest part of my music, and one of which was the Taxi theme that we were just talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And you might get frustrated and say to those stations or whatever, why aren't you playing my rough music? But it didn't fit their format. It didn't fit what they were trying to accomplish. And it may seem pompous to presumptuous to use classical music as an example, but you might think of Mozart as a smooth classical artist because his music is so smooth to people's ears. So you might hear, if you were a marketing person and you wanted to use classical music in a way to make people nice and comfortable in the background, you probably wouldn't want to put Bartok or Stravinsky on there,
or Liszt,
put Mozart on there. But it's too late for critics to make any kind of stand to blame Mozart for the fact that he was too smooth. It's a kind of ridiculous criticism to make.
Yeah,
so,
but Bob,
I don't mind being smooth, Michael.
It's
okay. It's just music. It's my music, and sometimes we like to say, those of us who are trying to make this music, you can call it whatever you want to call it, as long as you play it. And once you've played it, once we play our music for you, then we've done our best, and you're either going to like it or you're not going to like it, and that's life.
Yeah, I think one of the dilemmas, the controversies of smooth jazz, is that a lot of bands and artists get lumped into their smooth jazz. And I always look at it, there's smooth jazz and then there's smooth jazz. So there are the real artists that are making really great music and it's smooth. And there are the artists that they can play, they can record a tune. They don't have what the real artists have, but it has a smooth sound that all gets lumped together. That's not good for the whole genre, because then you don't like lumping things together and categorizing and things like that. One of the things I will tell our audience is that I saw you at the Blue Note once, and you did the most smoking rough jazz set that I could ever imagine from Bob James. And when I came up to you after the show, I said, Bob, that was amazing. I mean, I didn't even know you played like that. And your response, I'll paraphrase. It was like, oh, I can play that. I just, most of the time, I don't. And
well, it's really fun to be unpredictable too. If I had, I might get as much pleasure out of going in front of a rough, straight ahead jazz audience and play nothing but smooth music, and provoke them, and do the opposite in front of a smooth jazz audience and play crazy rough stuff too, because that's part of my job, and yet it is also my responsibility to give all listeners an experience, and then at that point it becomes their world. It's out of my hands and into theirs. And if I've done my job good enough, I have a good chance of making people like it. And if you don't mind, since we're blabbing on about this stuff, and this is our opportunity to talk together, we haven't talked in a long time. But over the last week, I've been doing my own little version of going live on the internet with solo piano playing, because I'm at my home, experiencing the social distancing and kind of self-quarantining. And through several people recommending that I do it, including my daughter, to do something constructive, I've started playing solo piano music from my home.
Oh, wow. And what time is it going the same time every day?
Same time every day, 10 o'clock in the morning, my time, Eastern Daylight Time, 10 a.m.
How do you log on?
I just go to my Facebook page.
Okay.
And I might change that now that your son he's going to give me maybe some new tips. That might be a better way for me to do it. I know I'm not the guy to talk to. I'm not on YouTube, for example. It's just Facebook. And I've been doing, yeah. So and I would, because the whole idea of it is to reach as many people as you can. Yeah. But I wanted to talk about a little bit different aspect of it, is that I've been doing a lot of soul searching about this role that we play as musicians. There's the mindset of not allowing the audience to influence your music too much, because they may water it down. You may start thinking, well, what are they going to like? I better change my music. I better make my music be what I perceive that the audience will like the most. And we think along those lines many different ways, one of which is to make money. We're professionals, and we think, well, if I play this kind of music, I'll make more money than if I play that kind of music. And suddenly it becomes possible to be in a nightmare of conflict with your own heart, your mind, your passion, your wallet, your everything, your friends. And so for me, suddenly being by myself, not being paid, nobody even asked me to do it. I'm at home at my own piano, uh, reaching out by going live and saying, "Here I am. This is Bob James, and I'm going to play the piano." There was no other marketing. There's nothing else attached to it other than what I wanted to do. But I still couldn't stop going through this process. For example, I opened my mouth very early on and said, "I'm willing to take requests," which is probably the stupidest thing that I possibly could have done, because I can't keep up with them. There would be too many requests coming from all over the place. And if I try to satisfy everybody, I won't be able to prepare properly the tunes that I chose. And part of the reason why I'm on there is a selfish one, to play my music. So I had to kind of focus my energy on remembering that throughout my career in music, I felt that if I went to my own passion first, if I could get as close to my own heart and convey that through the music, that I would have the best chance that people would respond to it in a good way. But the minute that I leave that and start thinking about it, and oh, what are they going to like? And oh, I better not play this piece. Oh, I better play that piece. Then I'm suddenly on such dangerous territory of wondering whether it's smooth enough or rough enough or anything else. And right now, today, coincidentally, I just did one of them right before we got on the phone, and that was what was going on in my mind. How close could I get to my own heart and just convey it raw through the piano?
Wow. Well, speaking of audience, I think we might answer a question. We have questions being asked by someone, Amina Kim, asking Bob, have you ever considered writing a songbook? And then goes on to say a memoir, if you will, of the stories behind the songs and the albums you've written, arranged, and played, etc. Brilliant musicians are among the greatest storytellers written in the language of music.
Well, hi, Mina. I
Mina.
think I met her a year or two ago, I think in LA at Catalina Jazz Club out there. Thank you and I've seen your name listening to piano stuff that I've done, and thank you very much for listening. And yes, I get asked this question a lot, and I've resisted it. I don't know. Maybe I'm afraid of it a little bit. I'm not sure, but a lot of people tell me that I have good stories, and I guess if you live long enough, I don't know how good they are, but I have a lot of them, and I have had a lot of opportunities. I think if I'm going to try to do it, I'm going to need to have a writer, as told by something, because I've got too much music that I want to do, and spending my creative time with that. But I appreciate your question very much, and I'm thinking about it a lot. And if I find that right person to collaborate with me, maybe I better do it while I'm still in possession of my memories and can still recount them.
Well, that's great. I'm going to put together for our audience, and they'll go online, what I think is the best of Bob James, a little compilation. I actually put together about 16 tracks that span your career. And I don't know if you remember because as you know better than anyone, song titles to instrumental sometimes are tough to figure out and remember. But
yes,
a couple of the tunes that I put on there that are classics are certainly Westchester Lady, Angela, your theme to Taxi, Restoration, which I thought was a brilliant tune. I was thinking about opening with that. And then one of the things you did, talk about, smooth, but also in the tradition. One of my favorite foreplay performances was West Coast Blues. I think it's a Wes Montgomery tune. And it is just, it's the best version I've ever heard. Touchdown is certainly on there. Carrie from One on One, which is an absolute classic. Shambuzi. Brighton by the Sea with Grover.
Thank you.
Ashanti, which is the opening track from Ivory Coast, which is just a great, great tune. Maputo, the one that a lot of people know with your collaboration with David Sanborn. Joyride, Dancing on the Water, but I'm not sure which version to put. The one that you did with Nancy Stagnita, or the one you had on, I can't remember which album. I think it may have been on Restoration.
Well, it was actually, the album was actually called Dancing on the Water. It was a kind of mostly solo piano album that I made some years ago. And by the way, in the two versions that I have on records, the one was with Nancy Stagnita, but the original version was with Chuck Loeb, who we talked about earlier, playing the guitar piano duet. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful song. Kicking Back, and then I like to close with, I get so sad when I listen to it, but one of the most beautiful songs you've written, A Waltz for Judy. Well, thank you so much. But I have to slightly correct you in that I wish I had written it. The song was prepared for an album that I did called The New Cool, which was duet project with Nathan East. And Nathan and Jeff Babco, LA keyboard player, wrote that song. And I get credit for it a lot, because Nathan's idea of the song was to make it a tribute to my wife, Judy. Very, very respectful. But I didn't actually compose it. I just had the honor to play this beautiful composition by Jeff Babco and Nathan. I picked that as my album of the year. I love that album when it came out. It's definitely the new cool. It's smooth, but it's airy. It's acoustic. It's just a beautiful record. And I'm glad that you clarified that, because now I don't have to have Nate and you on the show to clear up the history of that song. Right. Yeah, I was not going to attempt to take credit where credit wasn't deserved. That's for sure. Actually, for me, the New Cool does represent an album that didn't start out specifically to be what would be called smooth. And it's certain Nathan and I were deliberately trying to be creative and not fit into some marketing concept or strategy. We wanted to follow in the tradition of piano bass duo albums that we both liked. I had remembered one from a long time ago, Oscar Peterson and Ray Brown. Oh, sure. And a lot of them like that, Keith Jarrett records that he made, Charlie Hayden, and so on. So that was what got us rolling with it. But when I listen back to that record now, it does have a kind of smoothness about it that probably most of those cuts would not be appropriate for so-called smooth jazz radio, because they don't fit in enough into the formula of it. There's no saxophone on it, for example. I think you did something just naturally for you, if I could speak of that. And that is, that album does something that all great albums do. And that is, if you are a little bit smooth, it appeals to a smooth jazz audience, but a traditional audience will listen to that album and totally get it. And that's why I picked it as my album of the year that year, because it's just from start to finish, it's just a beautiful, airy, acoustic album that, that album is kind of your kind of blue. Woo. Well, I don't know that we could come anywhere close to deserving that, but that'd be about the ultimate compliment that you could possibly get. Thank you very much. Oh, sure. Just, I love albums that you can listen to over and over and over again and just not get sick of them. Me too. And that's what we strive for. So that again gets to my root of what I'm hoping for, but I still have to fight to keep my focus on what can I do that would give me the best chance of getting there, not what music should I attempt to copy or play because someone else did it.
Mhm.
If I go in the studio with a tenor sax and a trumpet and an alto sax and bass and drums, and I say, okay, I'm going to make a Kind of Blue album. At best that I could ever hope to come out would be second place, and I'm going to be a lot further down the line than that. So
Yeah.
that's not going to happen. I got to find my version of what leads me to magic, the closest that I can get there.
Well, speaking of copying, your music has been copied a lot, not only from other contemporary jazz, smooth jazz, trying to get that Bob James sound, and we're getting a comment here online about the godfather of hip hop too. That you're being called that, but your history with hip hop is pretty substantial. You want to talk about that?
Well, it's another example of unknowns. How in the world do things like this happen in the music business that you could never predict? Certainly, when I was in the 1970s at CTI, the last thing that I would have ever thought was that one of my records would end up being used in this rap hip hop field, which seemed to be so many universes apart from each other. And I could tell a little story about one of the ones that has been sampled the most in the hip hop world is a song that I wrote called Nautilus. Mm-hmm. And the peculiar, crazy outcome of that was that I was recording 1974 for CTI Records, and almost all of the projects that we were doing at that time, we had certain music that we were really focusing on, that we spent most of our time preparing and that we were really excited about. And I had two songs on that project that I knew were special for different reasons. And when Creed Taylor had asked me to come up with new material, I was primarily thinking of myself as an arranger, and I wasn't really headed out to do a solo artist career. Most of my work was in the studio arranging for other artists. But I did have a little bit background, both classical music and jazz. So I proposed to do an arrangement of Night on Bald Mountain for this project. And we used a big orchestra, strings and brass, and importantly, I got the right drummer, who was an up-and-coming guy at that time named Steve Gadd, and I featured the drums throughout this recording. And many, many, many years later, Steve thanked me because that session and that particular recording and his playing on it led to many, many good things for him in his career. So I like having been a little bit of a part of knowing how great he was back in those days. But there was one other song called Feel Like Making Love that was a result of me being in the studio as a sideman on Roberta Flack's recording session and listening to this new song that had been brought in by Gene McDaniels called Feel Like Making Love. And it was great. Every one of us in the studio knew how great it was and how great Roberta Flack sounded singing it. So I had the super duper perfect timing of being able to go in the studio coincidentally within a couple of weeks after that session with the same rhythm section, Gary King on bass, Eric Gale on guitar. No, it was not Eric Gale on guitar. It was Richie Resnikoff playing on my album. Mm-hmm. But Idris Muhammad was playing drums. And anyway, my recording sounded a lot like Roberta's because it was the same band and we were doing the song in the same key, maybe the same tempo, minus the vocal. So I got a lot of airplay back and forth with the radio stations because Roberta Flack's record became a big hit. And lucky to be part of it, and it changed my life because I was the instrumental cover that got a lot of attention and led to many, many good things. But at this very same time, buried deep into that project was a song called Nautilus that I it was a throwaway almost. We concentrated all of our energy on these other songs, and we had to have something else to fill out the album. So if you look at the LP version of my record one for CTI, you will find that Nautilus is the last cut on side B, which is buried so far because the likelihood is it's going to get no airplay and nobody's going to pay any attention to it, which they didn't at that time. It was the most interesting thing about it for me at that time was that Creed Taylor came up with a fun title for it because I used some kind of a synthesizer sound that sounded like a submarine, and so he called it Nautilus. Now 20 years go by, however long it took, and I start to hear that this recording is getting all kinds of attention, and the rap hip hop field and the use of recorded music in chunks and what became known as samples was becoming much more of a phenomenon than I ever thought there would be. I thought it was kind of fluky when I first heard about it. I couldn't believe it. You mean they're coming in, they're stealing my music, or they're just taking it? And very often that was the case when a lot of the early recordings. Eventually, as you and I both know, it became a legitimate industry also, of which I have a wonderful part of it, having been on the ground floor. For some magical reason, the early hip hop producers chose a few of my cuts to be chunks, to be samples. And I thank Idris Muhammad, who created the magic groove on Nautilus, for the reason why it's a good song to dance to in chunks.
Can you give us a little chunk of that?
Whoops, I can't even play it because I had Gary King playing this bass part at that time. Yeah, you caught me off guard because sometimes I've tried to practice so that I could play Gary King's part with my left hand and the melody with my right hand.
You need three hands.
Yeah, and you've had me talking too much, and my mind is way away from my fingers.
Speaking of three hands, let's talk about four hands. That was a very interesting project with Keiko.
Lovely memory, memory. And that one's kind of fluke too because it happened during the history of me with Keiko goes back to that album Dancing on the Water that I was working on at that time, which I had started it off as a solo project, but I wasn't having any fun. Playing solo piano was way too lonely for me, and I needed some companions. I needed some partners to play, and I missed not having any drums or bass or anything else. So for whatever reason, I thought that I would invite a couple of guests, one of whom was Chuck Loeb, who played the duet on that title song, Dancing on the Water. But I had been a fan of Keiko Matsui, and I'd only met her once. Her group she was playing at the Hollywood Bowl, I think. And I just very briefly met her backstage. But I had also been a fan of piano duet, four-hand piano, classical music. I loved doing it and as a hobby. And I thought about writing some four-hand original piano music, maybe for that project, and maybe invite a couple of my favorite pianists. So the choices that I made were Joe Sample and Keiko. And I didn't really know either one of them very well at that time. But in order to try to intrigue Keiko to be willing to accept the invitation, I sent over this piece that I had been working on. It ended up being called Altair and Vega, which, but she received this kind of unknown package and opened it up. And fortunately, she had positive feeling about it and agreed to join in with me for the recording. And that led to many things. We did several tours together. And my memory of some of those, a couple of them in particular, where we played concert halls where there was no sound system and no speakers, nothing. The one piano on the stage, we walk out, no amplification, and just the sound of the grand piano is all that you heard during the course of that night. That was just so much fun for me. She wrote several pieces for me on her projects. We've traded back and forth, and we still talk about maybe doing something, I hope, in the future too.
That's great. Yeah, that was most people hadn't had that experience of the four hands before that album. It was, even though, you know, you and I know that there have been projects that have done that in classical music, but great in contemporary jazz. It was I think you were the first.
Well, I will say that Joe Sample was more comfortable having his own piano. We did actually two different pianos with him, but I liked sitting on the same piano bench, and so it was fun for me to do just the four hands at one piano with her. And it was sort of an art form in itself. It's very challenging to try to keep out of the way of the other pianists, to keep your hands from bumping into each other in the middle of the keyboard. There were many things like that were a fun part of the challenge. And it was the most popular as an art form back in the 19th century when there were no recordings. And many local smaller towns didn't have the opportunity to hear symphonic music because there were no recordings and no big orchestras. So the composers, Beethoven and Brahms and Schubert, all of them did four-hand arrangements of symphonic music to reduce them down to the piano. But some of the music was so complex that one pianist couldn't do it. You had to have two pianists sitting there in order to cover the bass parts and the flutes and the high end and everything else. So it became a popular art form at that time, and I always loved it.
Wow. So we've covered classical, jazz, solo piano, group. Let's talk about pop music for a minute. You've produced some really great pop records. One of my favorites is one that I think you did with Phil Ramone with Kenny Loggins' "Celebrate Me Home."
Yeah, it was a great time. Kenny was looking to break away from his collaboration with Jim Messina and do his first solo project on his own. And he went to Columbia at that time where he was signed and said he was ready to do a solo project. And it was just, again, really good timing for me because I had just gotten the job through Bruce Lundvall of having a jazz A&R role there at Columbia. And in Kenny's mind, he was also looking to pull away from the just folk rock kind of sound that his previous records had, and he wanted to introduce jazz elements into it. And that's why he brought me in to be that voice that would just change the sound.
Yeah.
The project was very much him, and I had a minor role in it. I was just supposed to kind of be there to help him introduce occasionally some jazz elements into it. But it did give that record a unique sound for him that contributed to him launching on his own for a solo career. And along the way, the title song became such a standard, and Kenny was good enough to allow me to collaborate with him a little bit on that song and make a contribution to it as a composer too. So having a co-composer credit on that song every Christmas time now, it played so much. Is
beautiful.
Really great memory.
Yeah, you know, you're very, very humble, because when I hear the first two solo Kenny Loggins albums, I think the second one was called Night Watch.
Night Watch, yeah. That's the only two that I did with him.
But, you know, for Bob James fans, if you can imagine the Bob James sound with Kenny Loggins singing, it's a beautiful combination.
Thank you.
And,
It was a
and
lot
that,
of beautiful fun for me. And I learned a lot from him. The way he approached music was so different from the jazz musicians that I was working with for the most part, that I had to get into a completely different mindset to do the job for him. And he was so good and so talented. And there was so much genius coming out of him that just being in the uh, creative environment with him in the studio and writing with him was a very significant thing for me.
yeah, that's great. That's a great story. The thing about, artists like Kenny Loggins, I think what happens when they get immensely popular, songs like Footloose, a lot of people don't know that there is a lot of, history and talent there that got them to Footloose.
Sure, of course. And Kenny's one of those kind of artists that he makes his music seem simple and very direct, even though it's not. There's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of complexity behind his music, a lot of subtlety that those of us who try to be supportive to him and try to help him reach his vision, we realize how much how deep he's trying to go, what he's aiming for, and it doesn't just happen automatically. There's a
Yeah.
lot of preparation going on. Now you talk a little bit for about 10 seconds because I just had the low power low battery, and I can plug power into my
Well, we
phone.
could, if you, I want to ask you one more thing, and then
Yeah.
we can wrap up if you'd like.
Well, I got 10% battery on
Oh,
that.
we're good. So I guess in closing, I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on, once we get out of this pandemic, what's next? You've done pop, jazz, classical. Any artists that you haven't collaborated with yet? Projects that you want to do? 6 record firm deals?
It's the biggest question on my mind all the time, Michael. I'm home by myself. I live alone now. So I have way too much time to think about that stuff. I'm thinking about it all the time. And I still have so many ideas about what I want to do. And I'm very fortunate that I have people that still want to work with me. And I think it's going to have to be choice of just starting to kind of go one at a time, make a commitment. Back over the last, let's say, 6 or 7 years, I've gone back and forth trying to do my bucket list, and one of which was that I wanted to have the opportunity to work with larger ensembles, symphony orchestra, and finally took on the challenge of doing a full-scale, long-form classical piece, which was a piano concerto, and very difficult for me, challenging. And I spent a couple of years working on it, actually composing it, and ended up getting 3 performances. It ended up being a mixed feeling. Some of it was very exciting, some of it was very stimulating, some of it also very frustrating because I think that I never got to the place that I wanted it to go. So on my continued bucket list is the question of whether I want to try to keep pursuing that and do another large scale work, maybe a ballet or maybe a symphony. I don't know yet because it's in the back of my mind, but I'm nervous about whether I have enough energy in me to do that. I have some young people that I admire a lot, talent wise, that I would like to be a mentor in the same way that I was for Kirk, because we both know that these kind of talents are they're coming along all the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I had a wonderful experience over in the Ukraine toward the end of last year with a young saxophonist who had sent me a tape. And then maybe it's a variation on the same theme that happened for me with Kirk, but this is a guy named Andriy Schmut, who is brilliantly talented young kid in his 20s. And just out of the blue, he sent me a tape of one of his songs that he imagined me playing a solo on it. And I liked it so much that without even making a deal with him or any talk about payment or anything else, I just put my piano part on it and sent it back to him. Told him how much I liked it. And one thing led to another. His record came out. It's really, really great.
I'd love to hear it.
Single from it's called Moving Forward. And he invited me to come to Kiev, to Ukraine. And I played a concert with him with this crazy rhythm section. Two guys from Nigeria, was bass player and a drummer, and we had strings and whole production thing. And he's so talented and full of ideas. He sends me a new piece almost every day now, and
Wow.
wants to do a project together. So that's on my bucket list, and other stuff. So I got too much going on to even keep up with. Not even thinking in the furthest part of my mind about any kind of retirement.
Well, that's great. Well, I'm wondering, with the technology available to us today, and in us staying at home, maybe a virtual project.
Well, that's exactly what I'm going to have to do, because this looks like at least a month and more, and I can work at home and I can send my files back and forth. And I'm in the middle of doing that right now.
Yeah.
And I want to do that. I was doing it already quite a bit, even before we had the problem with the virus, but now even more so.
Well,
And
let's
everything.
when you move things along, let's get back on this Jazz's Daily Brunch and show everyone what you're up to.
I'd love to.
Bob,
Absolutely. And I appreciate your interest. And most of all, I appreciate the friendship.
Likewise, Bob. And again, stay safe, and we'll be in touch. And thanks again.
Thank you, Michael. Love to your family. And let's get
Love to
together in
yours as
person.
well. Say hi to Hillary for me.
I will.
All right. Bye-bye.